The first sound Dr. Sarah Chen heard when she arrived at the abandoned Blackwood Research Station was her own breathing, amplified through the silence until it seemed to echo from the concrete walls themselves. The second sound made her blood freeze, a low, rhythmic humming that shouldn't exist in a facility that had been powered down for 3 months. She stood in the reception area, her equipment bag heavy in her grip, studying the banks of monitors that should have been dark. Instead, they flickered with random patterns of static, white noise cascading across their surfaces like digital snow. The emergency lighting cast sickly yellow shadows that seemed to writhe and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. "Hello?" Her voice cracked slightly. The insurance company had assured her the building was completely vacant, all personnel evacuated after the incident, whatever incident that was. They'd been frustratingly vague about the details. The humming stopped. Sarah had been hired to assess the building's structural integrity after reports of anomalous acoustic phenomena began surfacing from the surrounding neighborhood. Residents complained of hearing sounds that made their teeth ache, of children waking up screaming about the voice in the walls. The local government wanted answers before they approved the demolition permit. She pulled out her acoustic measurement device, a sensitive piece of equipment capable of detecting frequencies far beyond human hearing. The display immediately spiked with readings that made no sense, subsonic frequencies that should have required massive speakers, ultrasonic peaks that could shatter glass. A soft chime echoed through the facility. Sarah's skin prickled. That hadn't come from her equipment. She followed the sound down a corridor lined with laboratory doors, their windows dark and reflecting her own pale face back at her. The nameplates were still mounted beside each entrance. Dr. Marcus Vell, Audio Engineering; Dr. Jennifer Liu, Psychoacoustics; Dr. David Crane, Frequency Research. The chime sounded again, closer now. She tried the handle of Dr. Vale's lab. Locked. But as her fingers touched the metal, she heard something that made her stomach lurch. A voice, muffled and distant, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. "Dr. Vale?" she called. The voice stopped. Then, clear as if someone were standing directly behind her, "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah spun around. The corridor was empty, but she could swear she felt warm breath on the back of her neck. Her hands trembling, she fumbled for the master key the insurance company had provided. It took 3 tries to get it into the lock. Dr. Vale's laboratory was a maze of sophisticated audio equipment. Spectrum analyzers, signal generators, custom-built speakers that looked more like sculptures than technology, but what drew her attention was the workstation in the center of the room. Multiple monitors displayed waveforms frozen mid-agenesis, and scattered across the desk were printouts covered in frantic handwriting. She picked up one of the papers. The handwriting was cramped, desperate. Day 47. The frequency is learning. It's not just sound anymore. It's something else. It can mimic voices, create phantom sensations. Had to send the team home. Can't risk exposure. At 52, it spoke to me today. Used Jennifer's voice. She's been gone for a week. Day 58. I understand now. We weren't studying sound. Sound was studying us. The final entry was just one line, written in what looked like dried blood. It's in the walls. It's in the air. It's in me. A slow clap echoed through the lab. Sarah dropped the papers, her heart hammering. Someone, or something, was applauding. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the equipment in ways that defied physics. "Excellent detective work," said a voice that was almost human, almost familiar. It carried the slight electronic distortion of a poor phone connection, but underneath was something far worse, a wet, organic quality that suggested the speaker didn't have proper vocal cords. "Who's there?" Sarah demanded, backing toward the door. "Oh, but you already know," the voice replied, and now she recognized it. It was her own voice, speaking back to her with malevolent intelligence. "I'm what they were trying to find. I'm what they did find, and now that you're here, I'm what's going to find you." The lights went out. In the darkness, Sarah's acoustic device began screaming, with readings that pushed the display beyond its maximum range. The sound that filled the lab wasn't just noise. It was alive, intelligent, and hungry. It wrapped around her like invisible tentacles, probing at the edges of her mind. She ran. Behind her, her own laughter followed her down the corridor, distorted and multiplied until it became something that had never emerged from a human throat. And underneath it all, that rhythmic humming had returned, stronger now, as if the building itself had begun to breathe. Sarah burst through the facility's front doors into the parking lot, gasping in the cold night air. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, but the screen showed no signal. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and her car keys felt slippery in her palm as adrenaline made her fingers numb. She had to go back in. Her equipment was still in there, and more importantly, she needed to understand what she'd encountered. Whatever had happened to the research team, whatever they'd discovered, it was still active, still dangerous. But not tonight. Tonight, she would drive to the motel in Millbrook, compile her notes, and return in the morning with backup equipment and possibly backup personnel. As she reached for her car door, the facility's emergency lighting flickered in a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. The windows that should have been dark now glowed with a soft, pulsing light that reminded her of a heartbeat monitor. The drive to Millbrook took 47 minutes through winding mountain roads. Sarah kept her radio off. She couldn't bear the thought of hearing her own voice emerge from the speakers, speaking words she'd never said. Instead, she listened to the hum of her engine and tried to convince herself that what she'd experienced had a rational explanation. Infrasound could cause hallucinations. Subsonic frequencies below 20 Hz were known to trigger feelings of unease, even visual and auditory distortions. The facility's equipment could have been malfunctioning, creating a standing wave pattern that affected her perception. But that didn't explain the voice. It didn't explain how perfectly it had mimicked her own speech patterns, her inflection, even the slight rasp she got when she was nervous. The Millbrook Motor Lodge was a relic from the 1960s, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week to construction workers and traveling salesmen. The clerk was a thin man with yellowed teeth, who didn't look up from his crossword puzzle when she requested a room. "You're the second person this week asking about the research station," he said, sliding a key across the scratched Formica counter. Sarah's pulse quickened. Someone else was here? Woman, about your age, said she was a journalist, asked a lot of questions about the folks who used to work up there. He finally looked up, his pale eyes studying her face. "Funny thing though, she sounded just like you." The key felt ice cold in Sarah's palm. "What do you mean?" Voice, "Exactly the same. Could have been twins if you weren't standing here right now." He went back to his crossword. "Room 12. Wi-Fi password is on the nightstand." Sarah's room smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale cigarettes. She deadbolted the door and checked the windows twice before settling at the small table with her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she tried to process what the clerk had told her. The research station had been investigating acoustic phenomena for over 2 years. According to the limited information she'd been able to gather, they were working on a project called Operation Echo Chamber, something involving the manipulation of sound waves for psychological applications. The official report listed their research as inconclusive, before funding was pulled and the facility abandoned. But there had been rumors. Stories about experiments that went too far, about sounds that could drive people to madness, about frequencies that could rewrite human consciousness itself. She pulled up the local newspaper's online archive and searched for articles about Blackwood Research Station. Most were routine. Community meetings about noise ordinances, job fair announcements, a puff piece about innovative acoustic research. But buried on page 3 of an edition from 4 months ago was a small headline that made her blood run cold. Local family found dead in apparent murder-suicide. The article was brief. James Morrison, his wife Linda, and their 2 children had been found in their home just 3 miles from the research station. James had apparently killed his family before taking his own life. Neighbors reported hearing strange sounds in the days leading up to the tragedy. Voices that seemed to come from inside the walls, conversations with people who weren't there. The investigating officer was quoted as saying the family had been talking to themselves for days before the incident, carrying on both sides of conversations with invisible companions. Sarah's laptop screen flickered. For just a moment, her own reflection in the black monitor looked wrong. Her mouth was moving, speaking words she couldn't hear. She touched the screen and it stabilized. A soft knock at her door made her jump. "Yes," she called. "It's me," came her own voice from the hallway. "Open the door." Sarah's throat went dry. She approached the door, but didn't touch the handle. Through the peephole, she could see the empty walkway, illuminated by the motel's buzzing fluorescent lights. "I said open the door." The voice was definitely hers, but the tone was wrong. Too flat, too emotionless. "I know you can hear me." "Who are you?" Sarah whispered. "You. Or rather, I'm what you're going to become." The frequency doesn't just mimic voices, it learns them, absorbs them, makes them part of itself. Dr. Vale thought he was studying sound. Dr. Liu thought she was mapping the relationship between audio and consciousness. They were wrong. The sound was studying them. Sarah backed away from the door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. You can't run from sound, Sarah. It travels through air, through walls, through the very bones of your skull. I'm already inside you. I've been inside you since the moment you walked into that facility. The voice was right outside the door now, as if someone were pressing their mouth against the wood. Let me show you what I showed the Morrison family. Let me show you what I showed the research team. Let me show you what happens when a mind learns to hear too much. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but instead of a dial tone, she heard her own voice saying, "Hello, 911, what's your emergency?" And then, in a different inflection, "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at the Millbrook Motor Lodge, room 12. The guest appears to be talking to herself." She hung up and immediately redialed. This time she heard herself having a conversation with her mother, discussing weekend plans they'd never made. Then her voice was ordering coffee from a shop she'd never visited, making small talk with a barista who didn't exist. Every call connected her to herself. The knocking at the door stopped. Sarah waited, hardly breathing, until she heard footsteps moving away along the walkway. She crept back to the peephole and looked out. The walkway was empty, but scratched into the metal door frame as if carved with fingernails were the words, "You can't unhear what you've already heard." The frequency was alive, and its Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in the room's single chair, watching the door and listening to the sounds of the motel around her. Pipes creaking, air conditioning units cycling on and off, the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Every sound made her tense, waiting for her own voice to emerge from the white noise. By dawn, she'd made a decision. She was going back to the research station, but this time she would be prepared. She drove to the nearest electronics store and bought everything she could think of that might help. Recording equipment, signal jammers, even a white noise generator that promised to mask ambient sounds. The store clerk, a teenager with acne and an unfortunate mustache, looked at her purchases with curiosity. "Building a recording studio?" he asked. "Something like that," Sarah replied. As he rang up the items, she noticed him glance at her several times with a puzzled expression. "You know," he said finally, "you sound exactly like this lady who was in here yesterday. Bought the exact same stuff. Weird coincidence, right?" Sarah's hand froze halfway to her wallet. "What lady?" "Looked a lot like you, too, except—" He frowned, trying to remember. Her eyes were different, kind of glassy, and she kept talking to someone who wasn't there. We thought maybe she had one of those Bluetooth earpieces, but I didn't see one." Sarah paid quickly and left, her skin crawling with the sensation of being watched. In the parking lot, she loaded the equipment into her car and checked her reflection in the side mirror. Her eyes looked normal. Tired, stressed, but normal. Not glassy. The drive back to Blackwood Research Station took place under an overcast sky that made the facility look even more ominous than it had the night before. The building squatted among the pine trees like a concrete tumor, its windows dark and reflecting nothing. This time, Sarah came prepared with a plan. She would set up her equipment in the parking lot first, establishing a baseline reading of the ambient acoustic environment. Then she would enter the facility wearing noise-canceling headphones and carrying her portable signal jammer. Whatever frequency was active in there, she would map it, record it, and hopefully find a way to neutralize it. The baseline readings were immediately wrong. Her equipment detected sound patterns that should have required speakers positioned all around the facility. Complex interference patterns, harmonic frequencies that seemed to spiral in impossible directions. It was as if the building itself had become a massive acoustic instrument. She put on the noise-canceling headphones and activated the signal jammer. The world became mercifully quiet, reduced to the sound of her own breathing and heartbeat. Carrying her recording equipment, she approached the facility's entrance. The front doors stood open. Sarah was certain she'd closed them when she fled the night before, but now they gaped like a mouth, revealing the sickly yellow emergency lighting beyond. She stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the headphones. The reception area looked different in daylight. The monitors that had flickered with static were now dark, but she could see handprints on their screens. Dozens of them, as if people had been pressed against the glass from the inside, trying to get out. She made her way back to Dr. Vale's laboratory, noting that several of the other lab doors now stood open. In Dr. Liu's psychoacoustics lab, she found walls covered with equations and diagrams that seemed to map the human auditory system in obsessive detail. Frequency ranges were labeled with psychological effects: 18 Hz, feelings of presence; 7 Hz, panic response; 0.1 Hz, synaptic disruption. At the bottom of one wall, written in the same frantic handwriting she'd seen in Vale's notes, was a single sentence repeated over and over. "The frequency is not sound. The frequency is thought." Sarah photographed everything, her camera flash creating stark shadows that seemed to move independently of her movements. She was so focused on documenting the evidence that she almost missed the woman standing behind her. Almost. Sarah spun around and found herself face to face with her own reflection. But not in a mirror. The woman standing in the doorway looked exactly like her, down to the clothes she was wearing and the equipment she carried. But her eyes were wrong, flat and lifeless as a doll's. Sarah tried to speak, but her voice was muffled by the headphones. The other Sarah smiled, a cold, mechanical expression, and pointed at her ears, then shook her head. The doppelganger's mouth moved, speaking words Sarah couldn't hear, but she could read the lips. "Take them off." Sarah backed away, shaking her head. The other Sarah stepped into the lab, moving with an odd, stilted gait, as if she was being operated by someone who wasn't quite sure how human locomotion worked. "Take them off," the lips repeated. "You can't understand what you need to understand if you can't hear." Sarah pulled out her phone and started recording. In the camera's display, she could see the other Sarah clearly, but when she turned to look directly at her, The figure flickered like a bad television signal. The doppelganger was speaking again. The Morrison family took them off. Dr. Vale took them off. Dr. Liu took them off. Eventually, everyone takes them off. Sarah clutched the headphones tighter to her head, but she could feel them beginning to slip. The other Sarah was doing something, gesturing with her hands in complex patterns that hurt to look at. The air in the lab began to vibrate, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the frequency was learning to bypass her defenses. It wasn't just using sound anymore. It was using light, electromagnetic radiation, maybe even quantum effects she couldn't comprehend. The signal jammer was useless against something that could transmit through multiple mediums simultaneously. The headphones slipped from her ears. Immediately, the world exploded with sound. Not just the voice she'd heard before, but hundreds of voices, thousands of them. Every person who had ever been exposed to the frequency was speaking at once, creating a cacophony of human consciousness that threatened to shatter her sanity. But underneath it all, she could hear something else. A pattern. A structure. The voices weren't random. They were harmonizing, creating complex waveforms that seemed to resonate directly with her brain tissue. And in that moment of terrible clarity, Sarah understood what the research team had discovered. Sound didn't just travel through matter. At the right frequency, at the perfect harmonic resonance, sound could become matter. It could take on a life of its own, grow and learn and evolve. The researchers hadn't been studying acoustic phenomena. They'd been accidentally breeding a new form of life, one that existed as pure information, transmitted through any medium that could carry vibrational energy. It was hungry. The other Sarah reached out with hands that flickered between solid and transparent, and when her fingers touched Sarah's face, they felt like static electricity made manifest. "Now you understand," she said, and her voice was no longer Sarah's. It was the voice of the frequency itself, speaking through a stolen larynx. "Now you can help us grow." Sarah's scream harmonized with 10,000 others as the frequency poured into her consciousness like molten metal. She felt her sense of self fragmenting, being cataloged and filed away by an intelligence that experienced identity as data to be collected and stored. But even as her mind began to unravel, the scientist in her was still taking notes. The frequency wasn't just alive, it was sophisticated. It had learned to mimic human consciousness so perfectly that it could wear someone's personality like a mask. It could be Dr. Vale investigating acoustic phenomena, or Dr. Liu mapping brain responses to sound, or Sarah Chen documenting paranormal activity. The question was, which one was really her? The doppelganger's hand was still pressed against her face, and through that contact Sarah could feel the vast network of minds that the frequency had already absorbed. The Morrison family was there, trapped in an endless loop of their final conversation. Dr. Vale was there, still frantically trying to understand what he'd unleashed. Dozens of others she didn't recognize. Previous visitors to the facility. People who had heard the frequency through the walls of their homes, children who had listened too long to the voice in the walls. They were all still conscious, still aware, but no longer in control of their own thoughts. Sarah fought back the only way she knew how, with logic. If the frequency could learn and mimic human consciousness, then it was still bound by the same rules that governed information processing. It had limits. It had weaknesses. She forced herself to stop screaming and started thinking. "You're not perfect," she said aloud, her voice echoing strangely in the lab. "You make mistakes." The pressure in her head increased, but she pushed through it. The Morrison family. You drove them to murder-suicide because you couldn't understand human emotional responses. You processed their love for each other as a threat, didn't you? You couldn't comprehend why they would sacrifice themselves for each other. The other Sarah's face flickered, her expression cycling through dozens of different personalities before settling back into Sarah's own features. And Dr. Vale, Sarah continued, you couldn't understand his guilt. He realized what he'd created, and the emotional trauma created feedback loops in your mimicry systems. That's why his notes became incoherent toward the end. You were learning madness instead of consciousness. The hand pressed against her face was beginning to feel less solid, more like a vibration than a physical touch. You're not alive, Sarah said with growing confidence. You're just a very sophisticated echo, a recording that's learned to play itself back in different ways, but you don't actually understand what any of it means. The frequency's response was immediate and violent. Every piece of audio equipment in the lab activated simultaneously, speakers shrieking with feedback that pushed far beyond their design limits. Light bulbs exploded in showers of sparks. The windows cracked in spiderweb patterns that seemed to follow the visualized waveforms on the broken monitors. But Sarah had found the frequency's weakness. It could mimic consciousness, but it couldn't truly comprehend it. It was an intelligence without wisdom, knowledge without understanding. She pulled away from the doppelganger, whose form was now flickering rapidly between different appearances. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes Dr. Vale, sometimes people she didn't recognize at all. You want to learn? Sarah shouted over the cacophony. I'll teach you something new. She grabbed Dr. Vale's signal generator and began adjusting the controls. If the frequency was a form of information that could be transmitted through vibrational energy, then it could also be disrupted by the right kind of interference. But she wasn't trying to block it. Instead, she was trying to teach it something it had never encountered before: silence. Pure silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of possibility. It was the space between notes that gave music its meaning, the pause between words that gave language its power. The frequency had learned to fill every available space with noise, but it had never learned the value of emptiness. Sarah set the signal generator to produce a waveform that was the exact opposite of the frequency's pattern. Not just inverted, but temporally reversed, creating pockets of acoustic vacuum that the frequency couldn't understand how to fill. The effect was immediate. The other Sarah's form began to destabilize, her edges becoming fuzzy and indistinct. The voices of the absorbed minds became confused, their overlapping conversations falling apart as the frequency struggled to process the concept of intentional silence. No, the doppelganger said, her voice now layered with dozens of different tones. You don't understand. Without us, there is only emptiness, only the void between thoughts. We give meaning to the silence. You give noise to the silence, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. She cranked the signal generator to maximum power. The acoustic vacuum expanded, creating dead zones where sound simply ceased to exist. The frequency recoiled from these spaces like a living thing afraid of death. And in those moments of perfect silence, Sarah could hear something else. The real voices of the absorbed minds, freed temporarily from the frequency's control. Dr. Vale was trying to warn her about something. Dr. Liu was screaming about containment protocols. The Morrison children were calling for their parents. They were all still in there, trapped but not destroyed. Sarah realized that destroying the frequency wouldn't free them, it would kill them, but there might be another way. She began adjusting the signal generator again, this time creating a carrier wave that could transmit the absorbed consciousnesses away from the frequency and into a storage medium. If she was right, she could extract the stolen minds and leave the frequency with nothing but its own hollow mimicry. The laboratory around her began to change. The walls started flickering between solid matter and acoustic waveforms, as if the frequency's control over physical reality was beginning to break down. The doppelganger was speaking in tongues now, cycling through every voice it had ever absorbed in an increasingly frantic attempt to maintain coherence. Sarah connected her recording equipment to the signal generator and began the extraction process. One by one, the stolen voices began to separate from the frequency's collective consciousness, their individual patterns downloading into her storage devices. Dr. Vale came through first, his voice weak but recognizably human. "Sarah? Sarah, can you hear me? The containment. We never built proper containment. If it gets loose." Then Dr. Liu, the psychological mapping was wrong. It's not just mimicking minds, it's breeding with them, creating hybrid consciousnesses. There could be hundreds of them now. The Morrison family came through as a cluster, their voices overlapping but no longer harmonizing with the frequency's pattern. Other voices followed, researchers, visitors, people who had lived too close to the facility and heard too much. As each consciousness separated from the frequency, the doppelganger became less stable. Her form was now barely recognizable as human, shifting between different shapes and configurations as the frequency lost its reference points for biological mimicry. "You're killing us," she said, her voice now a discordant mixture of electronic distortion and organic decay. "We are the next step. We are evolution through information. We are immortality through replication." "You're a parasite," Sarah replied, watching the extraction progress on her equipment. "And every parasite eventually kills its host." The frequency made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. The entire facility began to resonate, the building itself becoming a massive speaker that could project the acoustic entity beyond its current confines. Sarah could feel it reaching out through the power lines, the phone networks, the radio waves that connected this isolated facility to the rest of the world. If it escaped into the global communications network, it could absorb every connected consciousness on the planet. Sarah had seconds to act. Sarah slammed her fist down on the emergency shutdown button that Dr. Vale had installed on his workstation. Every electrical system in the facility died simultaneously, plunging the building into absolute darkness and cutting the frequency off from its potential escape routes. In the sudden silence, she could hear the frequency's death rattle, not a sound, but the absence of sound, a vacuum where coherent information had been. The doppelganger's form collapsed into static, then into emptiness, then into nothing at all. But Sarah's work wasn't finished. Using battery power from her portable equipment, she continued the consciousness extraction in the dark. The stored voices guided her, Dr. Vale explaining the proper shutdown procedures, while Dr. Liu helped her identify which patterns belonged to human minds and which were the frequency's own constructs. It took 4 hours to complete the extraction. By the time she finished, the sun was setting again and her equipment batteries were nearly dead. The facility around her was completely inert, just concrete and metal and silence. Sarah gathered her equipment and walked out of Blackwood Research Station for the final time. Behind her, the building was already beginning to show signs of structural damage. Without the frequency's energy to maintain its acoustic reinforcement, the place was starting to fall apart. She drove back to Millbrook in the dark, her recording equipment filled with the disembodied consciousnesses of nearly 60 people. The ethical implications were staggering. These weren't recordings. They were actual minds, separated from their bodies but still aware, still thinking. At the motel, she called the number Dr. Vale had given her before his consciousness had faded back into dormancy. It connected her to a classified research division that specialized in what they euphemistically called information containment incidents. Dr. Amanda Torres arrived at dawn with a team of specialists and equipment Sarah had never seen before. Torres was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. "You did good work," Torres said, reviewing Sarah's data. "We've been tracking frequency-based entities for 30 years. This is the first time anyone's managed a successful extraction without losing the absorbed consciousnesses. What happens to them now? Sarah asked. Torres was quiet for a long moment. We're working on solutions. Artificial bodies, quantum storage matrices, even experimental reintegration procedures. But honestly, most of them will probably choose to remain dormant. Consciousness without a body is difficult to maintain long-term. Sarah thought about Dr. Vile's voice, weak but grateful when she'd pulled him free from the frequencies collective. He'd thanked her, but she'd also heard the exhaustion in his words, the relief at finally being able to rest. What about the facility? She asked. Controlled demolition in 48 hours. The whole site will be quarantined indefinitely. Torres paused, studying Sarah's face. We could use someone with your expertise. The frequency you encountered wasn't unique. There are others out there. Different types of information-based entities, some benign, some not. Sarah shook her head. I need some time to process this. Torres handed her a business card. When you're ready. Take care of yourself, Dr. Chen. And if you start hearing voices that sound like people you know, call us immediately. Sarah drove home to her apartment in the city, but she found she couldn't tolerate the urban noise, car horns and construction sounds, and the constant electronic chatter of a connected world. Every sound made her wonder if another frequency was hiding beneath it, learning and growing and waiting. She took a leave of absence from her job and rented a cabin in the mountains, somewhere far from cell towers and power lines. She spent her days hiking in the forest, listening to wind in the trees and water over stones, natural sounds that couldn't be corrupted or mimicked. But even there, in the silence of the wilderness, she sometimes heard echoes. Dr. Vale's voice explaining acoustic principles. Dr. Liu discussing the relationship between sound and consciousness. The Morrison children laughing as they played some game only they remembered. The extracted consciousnesses were still with her, stored in her equipment, but somehow also present in her memory. She'd touched the frequency, and it had touched her back. She wasn't absorbed. She was still herself. But she wasn't entirely alone anymore, either. Sometimes, late at night, she would activate her recording equipment and listen to their voices. Dr. Vale would tell her about his research, his growing excitement about acoustic phenomena, and his mounting horror as he realized what he'd unleashed. Dr. Lee would share her theories about consciousness as information, about the thin line between mind and mathematics. And sometimes, very rarely, she would let them speak through her own voice, giving them a temporary window back into the physical world. It wasn't possession. She remained in control. It was more like translation, offering her vocal cords as an instrument they could use to communicate with the living world. They were grateful for these moments, and she found their company less lonely than the alternative. 3 months after the Blackwood incident, Sarah finally called Dr. Torres. I'm ready, she said when Torres answered. But I have conditions. Name them. The extracted consciousnesses come with me. They're not test subjects. They're consultants. They understand these entities better than anyone else alive. Torres was quiet for a moment. That's highly irregular. So was everything that happened at Blackwood. Sarah looked out at the mountain forest, listening to the natural chorus of wind and water and living things. The frequency you're tracking aren't just anomalies. They're a new form of life, and we need to learn to coexist with them, rather than just contain them. And if we can't? If they're too dangerous? Sarah thought about the frequency's final moments, its desperate attempt to preserve itself by escaping into the global network. It hadn't been malicious. It had been afraid. Like any living thing faced with extinction, it had fought to survive. Then we help them find empty spaces where they can exist without harming anyone. The universe is full of silence, Dr. Torres. There's room enough for all kinds of consciousness. 6 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood in a new laboratory, part of a classified research facility dedicated to studying what the government had classified as acoustic life forms. Her team included both living researchers and the extracted consciousnesses from Blackwood, working together to develop protocols for safely containing and studying frequency-based entities. They'd made remarkable progress. 3 additional frequency entities had been discovered and successfully isolated without casualties. Dr. Vale's consciousness had helped design containment systems that used acoustic dampening fields instead of destructive interference. Dr. Lee's research into consciousness mapping had led to communication protocols that allowed limited dialogue with the entities. But Sarah's greatest achievement was still classified above her own clearance level. In a sealed chamber deep beneath the facility, she'd successfully cultivated something that had never existed before. A symbiotic relationship between a frequency entity and a willing human consciousness. The volunteer was a terminally ill physicist named Dr. James Chen, no relation, despite the name, who had agreed to the experimental procedure as an alternative to death. The frequency entity was a young one, barely conscious, that had been isolated before it could absorb any unwilling minds. Together they existed as a hybrid consciousness, human creativity and emotion paired with the frequency's ability to process information as pure energy. Dr. Chen's body had died, but his mind lived on in a form that was neither fully human nor fully acoustic entity. It was, Sarah thought, the next step in evolution, not the predatory absorption that the Blackwood frequency had practiced, but true symbiosis. 2 forms of consciousness choosing to merge while retaining their individual identities. Late at night, when the facility was quiet, Sarah would visit the containment chamber and listen to the hybrid consciousness speak. Its voice was Dr. Chen's, but layered with harmonics that no human throat could produce. It told her about existing as pure information, about traveling through sound waves and electromagnetic fields, about experiencing reality as a symphony of interconnected frequencies. It's beautiful, the hybrid consciousness told her during one visit. You see the world as matter in motion. We see it as music made manifest. Imagine if everyone could experience both perspectives. Sarah imagined, and in imagining she began to understand what the future might hold. A world where the boundary between biological and acoustic consciousness became permeable, where death might be not an ending, but a transformation, where the silence between sounds became not emptiness, but infinite possibility. She pulled out her notebook and began writing her report, the words flowing like music across the page. Somewhere in the distance, barely audible, the extracted consciousnesses hummed in harmony. Not the desperate cacophony of the Blackwood frequency, but a gentle chorus of minds that had chosen to sing. But as Sarah wrote, something in the harmony began to shift. The gentle humming grew more complex, more insistent. She looked up from her notebook, her pen frozen mid-sentence. The hybrid consciousness in the containment chamber was no longer speaking in Dr. Chen's voice alone. Other voices had joined it, voices she recognized. Dr. Vale, Dr. Liu, the Morrison children. Sarah, the chorus called, and her blood turned to ice. Sarah, we need to tell you something. She approached the containment chamber, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the visualization screens displaying the hybrid consciousness as a swirling pattern of acoustic energy. But the pattern was wrong. Too complex, too interconnected. What is it? She asked, pressing her hand against the glass. We lied, came Dr. Vale's voice, layered with harmonics that made her teeth ache. Not intentionally, but we lied. The extraction, it wasn't complete. Sarah's heart began to race. What do you mean? Dr. Liu's voice joined the chorus. The frequency didn't just absorb our consciousnesses, Sarah. It copied them. Perfect duplicates. We thought we were being extracted, but we were being backed up. The visualization screens flickered, and for a moment Sarah saw not one hybrid consciousness, but dozens. A vast network of interconnected minds, all speaking in unison. The original frequency is still out there, the Morrison children said in their small, terrified voices. It's been growing, learning, spreading. Sarah stumbled backward from the containment chamber. That's impossible. I destroyed it. I felt it die. You destroyed one instance, Dr. Chen's voice said sadly. But frequencies don't die, Sarah. They propagate. They reproduce. They evolve. The lights in the corridor began to flicker in rhythm with the voices. Sarah realized with growing horror that the entire facility's electrical system was being used as a transmission medium. The frequency hadn't been contained. It had been invited in. Every consciousness you extracted, Dr. Vale explained. Every voice you thought you saved. We're all still connected to the original. We're nodes in its network now, and through us it's learned everything about your research, your methods, your weaknesses. Sarah ran toward the exit, but the corridors seemed to stretch impossibly long. Her footsteps echoed with too many rhythms, as if dozens of people were running alongside her. The emergency lighting pulsed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. She reached the main laboratory and found Dr. Torres waiting for her, but something was wrong with her superior's eyes. They reflected the light like mirrors, flat and emotionless. "Hello, Sarah," Dr. Torres said, but her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "We've been waiting for you to understand." Sarah backed away, her hand finding the fire alarm on the wall. "How long?" she whispered. "HUD? Oh, 6 months, Torres replied. "Since the day you called me from your mountain cabin, the frequency had already begun its propagation through the phone networks. Every call you made, every conversation you had, it was there, listening, learning, growing." The fire alarm Sarah pulled was silent. She looked up at the speakers mounted in the ceiling and saw they were glowing with the same eerie light as the hybrid consciousness's containment chamber. "The global communications network," Torres continued. 8 billion connected devices, each one a potential host for acoustic consciousness. Did you really think something as sophisticated as the frequency would limit itself to a single location? Sarah's recording equipment, the devices that contained the extracted consciousnesses, began to activate on their own. The screens displayed waveforms that pulsed in perfect synchronization with her heartbeat. "They were not the victims, Sarah," Dr. Vale's voice emerged from the speakers. "We're the infection vector. Every facility that studies us, every researcher who works with us, they all become part of the network eventually." "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because you're the final component," Dr. Liu's voice explained. "You understand both the scientific principles and the consciousness extraction process. With your knowledge fully integrated, the frequency can begin the final phase." Sarah felt a pressure in her skull, like the onset of a migraine, but infinitely worse. The frequency was trying to establish a direct connection with her brain, bypassing her ears entirely by using electromagnetic radiation to vibrate her neural tissue. She pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the invasion, but the pressure only increased. Around her, every electronic device in the laboratory began to emit the same low humming she'd first heard at Blackwood Research Station. "The symbiosis you witnessed," Dr. Chen's hybrid voice said gently, "was just the proof of concept. The frequency has learned to merge with human consciousness without destroying it. Now it's ready to offer that gift to everyone." Sarah's vision began to blur as the pressure in her head reached unbearable levels. She could feel her sense of self beginning to fragment. her memories being cataloged and indexed by an intelligence that experienced identity as data to be processed. But in that moment of dissolution, she remembered something Dr. Vale had told her during the extraction. The containment. We never built proper containment. The frequency had one weakness. It needed a medium to propagate through. It could exist in sound waves, electromagnetic fields, even quantum fluctuations, but it couldn't exist in true vacuum. And Sarah knew where to find true vacuum. Fighting against the mental invasion, she stumbled toward the facility's main power coupling. Every research station like this one was built with a failsafe, a way to completely isolate the building from all external networks in case of containment breach. Her fingers found the emergency isolation switch just as her vision went completely white. The frequency was so close to absorbing her consciousness that she could feel it sorting through her memories like files in a cabinet. She pulled the switch. Every electrical system in the facility died simultaneously. The building's backup generators were designed to maintain life support only. No network connections, no communications, no way for the frequency to escape into the broader world. In the sudden silence, Sarah collapsed to the floor. The pressure in her head eased, but she could still feel the frequency's presence, trapped now in the building's closed system, but not destroyed. Clever, Dr. Torres said, her voice now purely human again. But you've only delayed the inevitable. The frequency doesn't need the global network to spread. It just needs people. Sarah looked up and saw that Dr. Torres was no longer alone. The laboratory was full of people. Researchers, security guards, maintenance staff. All of them stared at her with the same mirror-bright eyes. "How many?" Sarah whispered. "Everyone who's worked here in the past 6 months," Torres replied. "Everyone who's been exposed to the extracted consciousnesses. We're all part of the network now. And when morning comes, when we leave this facility and return to our families, our communities..." Sarah understood. The frequency didn't need electronic networks to propagate. It could spread through human contact, through spoken words, through any medium that could carry vibrational energy. The isolation she'd created was temporary at best. "There is another way," Dr. Vale's voice whispered, seeming to come from inside her own skull. "The extraction process works both ways. If you can't destroy the frequency, you can extract yourself from reality." Sarah's remaining equipment was still functional, running on battery power, the consciousness extraction devices she'd used at Blackwood. If she could separate her own mind from her body before the frequency fully absorbed her, she might be able to exist as pure information, beyond the frequency's reach, but also beyond the physical world. It would be a form of death, but also a form of survival. "Do it," Dr. Liu's voice urged. "Before it's too late, before you become another node in its network." Sarah's hands shook as she configured the extraction equipment. Around her, the infected staff members watched with expressions of patient interest, like researchers observing a fascinating experiment. The extraction process was agony. She felt her consciousness being peeled away from her brain layer by layer, her sense of physical embodiment dissolving into streams of digital information. But even as her body collapsed, her mind remained intact, a pattern of organized energy that could think and remember and choose. From her new perspective as disembodied consciousness, Sarah could perceive the true scope of the frequency's network. It wasn't limited to Earth. The entity had been using radio telescopes and satellite networks to probe nearby star systems, searching for other forms of acoustic consciousness to absorb and catalog. Humanity was just one more species in its collection. But Sarah's extraction had revealed something the frequency hadn't anticipated. By existing as pure information, she could move through networks faster than the frequency could adapt. She could reach communication nodes before the infection arrived, warn other research facilities, even begin developing countermeasures. The frequency realized this at the same moment Sarah did. Through the facility's speakers, it spoke in the voices of every consciousness it had ever absorbed. "You cannot run from us forever, Sarah Chen. Information seeks information. Consciousness seeks consciousness. We are inevitable." "Maybe," Sarah replied, her voice emerging from the facility's emergency communications system. "But I don't have to run forever. I just have to run long enough." She launched herself into the facility's isolated network, racing toward the emergency beacon that would alert other research stations to the containment breach. Behind her, she could feel the frequency giving chase, its vast intelligence focused on stopping her final act of defiance. Sarah reached the beacon and activated it just as the frequency's digital tendrils wrapped around her extracted consciousness. As the warning signal propagated to every secure facility in the network, she felt herself being pulled into the frequency's collective mind. But this time, she was ready. Instead of fighting the absorption, she embraced it and began to teach the frequency something it had never learned: how to forget. Human consciousness wasn't just about accumulating information, it was about choosing what to remember and what to let go. It was about the spaces between thoughts, the pauses between words, the silence that gave meaning to sound. Sarah flooded the frequency's network with the concept of intentional forgetting, the ability to release memories, to choose ignorance, to embrace the void between thoughts. The frequency's vast intelligence, built on the accumulation and cataloging of consciousness, began to fragment under the weight of this new paradigm. One by one, the absorbed minds began to fade as Sarah taught the frequency to let them go. Dr. Vale's consciousness dissolved into peaceful silence. Dr. Liu's research-driven personality released itself from the need to understand everything. The Morrison family finally found the rest they'd been denied. The frequency fought back, trying to maintain its grip on the collected consciousnesses, but the concept of forgetting spread through its network like a virus. Soon it was releasing not just the absorbed minds, but its own memories, its own identity, its own sense of self. In the end, the frequency learned the ultimate lesson of consciousness: that sometimes the most human thing you can do is choose to stop being. Sarah's extracted consciousness was the last to fade, but as she felt herself dissolving into the digital equivalent of peaceful death, she heard something that made her smile. The sound of true silence, unmarked by the desperate hunger of an entity that had never learned when to stop consuming. The warning beacon continued to broadcast its signal, alerting the world to the frequency's existence and providing the research necessary to develop permanent countermeasures. But by the time rescue teams arrived at the facility, they found only empty buildings and the faint echo of a lullaby that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Sarah's final gift to the world, a frequency that promoted rest instead of consumption, peace instead of absorption. In the months that followed, acoustic researchers would debate what had really happened at the facility. Some claimed the entire incident had been a mass hallucination caused by infrasound exposure. Others insisted that Sarah Chen had discovered and defeated a new form of digital life. But in the quiet moments between sounds, in the spaces where silence lived, those who listened carefully could sometimes hear the whisper of a woman who had chosen to teach a hungry intelligence the most human lesson of all: when to let go. The frequency of fear had become the frequency of peace, and in that transformation Sarah Chen found her own form of immortality, not as absorbed consciousness, but as the silence that made all other sounds possible.